In the middle of a freezing night, Trieu Duong is suddenly jolted awake by a soft cry. Little Truc Lam is trembling in the cold, unable to sleep as icy wind slips through the cracks of their home. Holding his daughter close, Trieu Duong realizes the house can no longer protect her from the harsh night air. Without hesitation, he makes a quiet but determined decision to fix everything before the next night falls. But can Trieu Duong finish in time to keep Truc Lam warm and safe? If you enjoy gentle, heartwarming stories like this, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. The night had already sunk deep into the mountains when a sudden cry pierced through the darkness. It was soft at first, shaky and broken, but to a father's ears, it was enough to jolt Trieu Duong awake in an instant. His eyes flew open, and before his thoughts could fully catch up, his body had already turned toward the small figure beside him. Truc Lam was awake, her tiny face crumpled with discomfort. Little breaths uneven as she whimpered into the cold air. Outside, the forest wind had grown harsher than before. It rushed through the trees with a long, low howl, then slipped through every crack and opening in the wooden walls of the house. The thin planks trembled under the pressure of it. From the gaps in the walls, icy streams of air pushed straight into the sleeping corner, wrapping around the child like invisible fingers. No matter how small her body curled, no matter how many times she shifted in her sleep, there was no escaping that bitter cold. Trieu Duong quickly sat up and gathered Truc Lam into his arms. The moment he held her, he could feel how cold she had become. Her little hands were cool, her cheeks flushed pink from the chill, and her body kept twitching with discomfort, as though even in his embrace she still couldn't settle. His face tightened with worry. He pulled the thin blanket higher around her and pressed her close against his chest, trying to give her all the warmth here for a while. He stayed like that without moving, one arm wrapped securely around her, the other adjusting the blanket again and again so not even a corner would slip away. He lowered his head and gently rested his cheek against her hair, as if trying to shield her from the entire night with nothing but his own body. Every gust that came through the wall struck his back first now. He took the cold in silence, letting it land on him instead of her. But the wind was stubborn. It kept finding its way through the house, through every narrow space between the wooden boards, through every place that had been left unfinished or weakened with time. Even with Trieu Duong holding her tightly, the cold still slipped in around them. Truc Lam let out another small cry and turned her face against his chest, searching for comfort. Her sleep was broken, restless, uneasy. She wanted to rest, but the night would not let her. Trieu Duong looked down at her and felt his heart tighten. By the dim light of the dying fire, he could see her little face clearly. Her eyelashes were still wet, her lips slightly parted, her cheeks reddened by the cold. She was too young to say what hurt, too small to protect herself from the wind that pushed into the house again and again. All she could do was cry, squirm, and trust that the arms holding her would somehow make things better. That trust weighed heavily on him. He stroked her back in slow, gentle motions, whispering softly even though she could not fully understand his words. His voice was low and steady, the kind of voice meant not to explain the world, but to make it feel safe. He rocked her carefully, patient and tender, until her crying began to weaken into soft, tired whimpers. Still, her body remained tense. Every time the wind rose, she flinched in her sleep. And with each flinch, Trieu Duong's resolve grew stronger. He lifted his eyes and looked around the small house. In the dark, he noticed things he had been too busy to fully face before. The wall on one side had widened gaps where the wind came through most sharply. Near the corner, one section of the planks no longer fit tightly together. Another side had dried and shrunk, leaving thin openings that seemed small in daylight but felt merciless in the middle of a freezing night. During the day, perhaps he could ignore them for a while, but tonight, with Truc Lam trembling in his arms, every gap looked like a failure he could no longer postpone. He held her even closer. In that moment, nothing else seemed important. Not the unfinished tasks outside, not the work waiting for him at first light, not the daily burdens that usually filled his mind. All of it fell away before one simple truth. His daughter was cold, and this house was not protecting her the way it should. He stayed awake for the rest of the night. Whenever Truc Lam stirred, he soothed her. Whenever the blanket slipped, he pulled it back. Whenever the wind cut through the cracks again, he shifted his body to block it as much as he could. Sleep no longer mattered to him. The only thing that mattered was keeping her warm until morning. He endured the numbness spreading through his own shoulders and back without complaint. A father's comfort could wait, his child's could not. As the hours passed, his thoughts began to settle into quiet plans. He started noticing each place that needed to be fixed. That wall needed reinforcing. Those gaps needed sealing. The sleeping corner had to be better shielded from direct wind. The weak sections could not be left as they were. Piece by piece, in the silence of the night, he rebuilt the house in his mind before touching a single board. He thought about what materials he could gather, how quickly he could work, which section had to be repaired first so the warmth would no longer escape. The plan came not from convenience, but from love. There was no hesitation in it. By the time the sky outside began to soften with the first hint of dawn, Trieu Duong had already made his decision. He would set aside everything else. No other task would come before this. The house had to be repaired now, not later, not when there was more time, not after some other chore was finished. Another cold night like this was something he would not allow. When the first pale light slipped over the mountains, the wind still lingered in the air, but inside the house, Truc Lam had finally fallen into a deeper sleep. She was still tucked safely in her father's arms, her breathing now calmer, her face no longer twisted in distress. Trieu Duong looked at her for a long moment before carefully easing the blanket around her once more. His movements were slow and deliberate, as though even the morning itself should not disturb her. He adjusted the corner beneath her head, checked that her feet were covered, then stayed beside her a moment longer. There was exhaustion in his eyes from the sleepless night, but beneath it was something firmer, warmer, stronger. Worry had turned into determination. The helplessness he felt in the dark had become purpose in the light. He rose quietly and stepped outside. The morning air was sharp, carrying the same cold that had tormented them through the night. But now, instead of feeling defeated by it, he faced it head-on. He turned back and studied the house carefully from the outside, reading its weaknesses with the eyes of a father who had seen their cost. This was no longer just a shelter made to survive the weather. It had to become a place where his daughter could sleep in peace, and for that, he was ready to work with all he had. He knew the repairs would not be easy. Every board would take effort. Every section would demand time, materials, and strength. But compared to the sight of Truc Lam's red cheeks and broken sleep, none of that felt heavy. He would carry the burden gladly if it meant the cold could no longer reach her at night. Because when a father sees his child shiver in his arms, love stops being just a feeling. It becomes action. So as the sun slowly climbed over the trees, Trieu Duong wasted no more time. With the memory of her midnight cries still echoing in his heart, he prepared to rebuild the walls, seal the cracks, and hold warmth inside this house the way he had held Truc Lam through the night. With patience, with tenderness, and with everything he had. The sun had barely risen above the treetops when Trieu Duong began his work. The morning light was still pale, and the cold from the night had not yet faded. A thin mist lingered around the house, clinging to the ground and the wooden walls like a reminder of what had happened just a few hours before. But there was no hesitation in his movements. He stepped back once more, studying every side of the house with careful attention, his eyes tracing each crack, each uneven plank, each place where the wind had found its way in. Inside, Truc Lam was still asleep. That gave him time, but not comfort. He moved quickly, yet quietly, making sure every step he took would not disturb her rest. Before anything else, he gathered a few extra pieces of cloth and gently tucked them around her sleeping space, adding a temporary layer of protection. It wasn't much, but for now, it could help block some of the morning chill. He paused for a moment, watching her breathe steadily, her tiny chest rising and falling in a peaceful rhythm that had been missing during the night. Only after he was certain she was warm enough did he step fully outside and begin. The first task was clear. He had to seal the gaps. Trieu Duong walked toward the edge of the forest, where he had often gathered materials before. The ground was still damp, and each step left a faint imprint behind him. He searched carefully, choosing pieces of wood that were sturdy but flexible, branches that could be shaped and pressed into the openings between the walls. Along the way, he collected dried leaves, strips of bark, and anything that could help fill the spaces more tightly. Every choice he made carried purpose. He wasn't just gathering materials anymore. He was gathering warmth. When he returned, he didn't waste a single moment. He started with the side of the house that had faced the strongest wind during the night. Kneeling close to the wall, he ran his hand along the surface again, feeling the cold air still slipping through the narrow gaps. Then with steady hands, he began pressing the materials into place, piece by piece, carefully, patiently, without rushing. He pushed small bundles of dried leaves into the thinner cracks, using strips of bark to hold them in place. For wider openings, he fitted pieces of wood tightly together, adjusting them again and again till they no longer shifted under pressure. Each time he thought a gap was sealed, he would lean closer, testing it with his hand, making sure no cold air could pass through as easily as before. The work was slow, but he did not mind. Every small improvement meant one less breath of cold air reaching his daughter at night. As the sun climbed higher, the light grew warmer, but Trieu Duong continued working with the same intensity. Sweat began to form along his forehead despite the lingering chill. His hands became rougher with each movement, small scratches appearing as he pressed wood and bark into place. But he didn't stop, not even once, because in his mind, he could still hear her cry. From time to time, he would pause and glance toward the door, listening carefully. If there was even the slightest sound from inside, he would immediately step back in to check on her. Each time, he found her still asleep, still wrapped safely, her face now calmer than before. Those moments gave him strength, pushing him to continue with even greater care. By midday, one side of the house had already begun to look different. The walls, once uneven and full of small openings, now appeared thicker, more solid. The materials he added blended naturally with the structure, but more importantly, they created a barrier, something the wind would have to fight much harder to break through. But Trieu Duong was not satisfied yet. He knew the night wind would test every part of the house, not just one side. So without resting, he moved to the next section. This part had thinner planks, worn down over time, leaving fine cracks that were harder to see but just as dangerous in the cold. He leaned in, studying them closely, then began the same careful process again. Fill, press, adjust, check, over and over. The rhythm of his work became steady, almost quiet in its determination. There was no frustration, no impatience, only focus. Each movement carried the same thought: make it warmer, make it safer, make it better for her. Hours passed without him noticing. Inside, the light had shifted across the floor, slowly moving toward where Truc Lam lay. When she finally stirred, it was not from discomfort, but from the gentle warmth of the afternoon sun. She moved slightly, letting out a soft sound, then opened her eyes. This time, there was no cry, just quiet curiosity. Trieu Duong heard it immediately. He stopped what he was doing and walked back inside, his steps softer than before. When he saw her awake, looking around with calm, bright eyes, something inside him eased. He knelt beside her and gently placed his hand on her chest, feeling the warmth there. No trembling, no restless shifting, just comfort. A faint smile appeared on his face. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. Instead, he carefully lifted her into his arms again, holding her close. Not because she was cold this time, but simply because he wanted to. His hand moved slowly along her back, the same gentle rhythm from the night, but now without urgency, only affection. For a brief moment, the world felt still, but the work was not finished. After making sure she was settled and comfortable again, Trieu Duong laid her back down and returned outside. The sun was already beginning its slow descent, and he knew time was limited. Another night would come soon, and this time, the house had to be ready. He picked up his tools again, his movements just as steady as before. Now, however, there was something different in the air. It was no longer just urgency driving him, it was confidence. He had already seen the change. He had already felt the difference, and that gave him the strength to push forward, to complete what he started, to turn this fragile shelter into a place where his daughter could truly rest without fear of the cold creeping in. As the afternoon faded into evening, the house slowly transformed under his hands. Each sealed gap, each reinforced wall, each careful adjustment brought it closer to what it needed to be. Not perfect, not flawless, but strong enough to protect the small life inside it. And as the wind began to rise again in the distance, whispering through the trees like it had the night before, Trieu Duong did not look at it with worry anymore. This time, he was ready, because tonight, when the cold came, it would no longer find its way so easily inside. And if it tried, it would have to face more than just thin wooden walls. It would have to face a father who had already decided that his child would sleep in warmth, no matter what. On a freezing night deep in the forest, Trieu Duong is awakened by the sound of his daughter Truc Lam crying in discomfort. Cold wind slips through the cracks of their fragile wooden house, making it impossible for her to sleep. He holds her close, using his own body to shield her, but realizes that his warmth alone is not enough. Seeing her small face flush from the cold fills him with worry and determination. Through the sleepless night, he carefully observes every gap in the walls, planning how to fix them. As soon as morning arrives, Trieu Duong sets aside all other work and begins repairing the house. With patience and care, He seals every crack and reinforces the walls, determined to create a warmer, safer place where Truc Lam can finally sleep peacefully.